Hello, I'm Greg Lilly, and this is Overcoming Writer's Block. What is writer's block? A lot of people don't really write. They revise and revise and revise. So they'll do one chapter and work on it and never move forward. And that's a sign of writer's block, that you don't want to finish. You feel like it has to be perfect before you move on. One thing you'll learn is that it's best just to move forward, and you can always go back and revise. That is what stops a lot of people. Writer's block is avoidance, it's fear, it's pride that you might do something wrong and you don't want to do something wrong, and it's overthinking. Techniques to getting something finished. There are three, and we will go over the first one today. And then in other videos, we'll hit the other two. What I think the barriers to finishing a project are just coming up with ideas, the inspiration. And then the second one is time, finding the time to do it. Lots of us say, oh, I'm working, I can't do it. But finding that time is a big hurdle. And then the third one is doubt or fear. And that's feeling like, once I do it, what's the use? You know, if I don't get published right away, if I'm not a New York Times bestseller, why bother? So that's the three that we'll hit. So first off, I want to work on coming up with ideas. One technique that came from Natalie Goldberg, her book, Writing Down the Bones, is a great book. So if you haven't read that, put that on your list. What Natalie came up with was she calls automatic writing. And I've seen this come through in a lot of different ways. The technique has been around for years, but basically what you do is you put pen to paper and you write whatever comes into your mind for a set amount of time, say 15 minutes. So get your notebook out, get your pen or pencil, and set a timer for 15 minutes, and then just write just anything that comes to mind. And most people stall right there because it's like, I don't have anything. I don't have anything to write. The first thing, and you can write that, say, I don't have anything to write, and write it, and something will eventually come to mind. You can also start with a prompt. I like to maybe look around the room and say, okay, there's light coming through the window. Describe that. You can also do a prompt that is, I remember when, and that would spur a memory. So I remember when I first took a class on writing, you know, and if you can jump back and think about that, all those things that came up and who was there and what it felt like, you know, again, it's just getting the pencil moving and getting it all out of your head and onto paper. And 15 minutes, constant writing, and you can see what you've done. If you want to try an exercise, you can stop the video and do this one. The prompt is, I remember when I first saw the beach. Or if you live near the beach and you can't remember the first time you saw it, the first time I waded through a mountain creek. So that first experience, try and capture that on paper and set your timer for 15 minutes and start writing. Once you've done that, was there a dominant theme in that writing? Lots of times you'll find some nugget, something that grabs you and you stick with it. So it could be that the description of how the water felt, that may be something that really intrigues you and you stay with it. Or it could be the people around you. Maybe there was where your family was with you, some friends were with you, and those spurred some memories. Maybe you're focusing more on characters than setting and description. So it's good to come up with that. Maybe a story came out of it. Maybe it didn't. That's okay. Another thing, when you're trying to come up with some ideas, so you can do the automatic writing, it kind of empties your head and gets things on the paper. A second way to do it is think about things you are passionate about. Just do a list. So it's a brainstorm. Make a list of things that you really are interested in. So it could be, if it's landscaping, if it's gardening, if it's motorcycles, history, deer hunting, the Roaring Twenties, anything there that you find interesting, make a list. Sometimes you don't even realize that these things are things that you think about. To go with that, make a list of what you read, because you read things you're interested in. And it might be fiction, it might be nonfiction. You're always going to find something that speaks to you. And that might be a good thing to explore. When you're coming up with ideas, you want it to be something that you're invested in, something that you enjoy. If you find your idea that you really like and you start working on it, especially in the month when you're trying to write on it every day and you get stalled, there are two different ways to do it. Or two that I find. Basically, it's two forms of brainstorming. So if you run out of ideas, here's a couple of techniques that'll work for me. One is basic brainstorming, just what we did in the exercises before, where you make lists. Or take a piece of paper, start making a list of everything that pops in your head about a certain subject. The second one is a bubble graph. And I've used that before. It's one of my favorite things. Basically, it's another form of brainstorming, but it's very visual. So I'll show you an example of this. We used to do this a lot when I was in project management and in information technology. We would kind of map out what we were trying to do. So here's what you do. Get a piece of paper, blank piece of paper, in the middle of it, draw a circle. And then write your current character situation. So you're stalled, you don't know what to do. Here's where your character is. Here's where the story has stopped. And put that in a circle in the middle. In this example, we're using Dorothy, and Dorothy wants independence. Next, think about what could happen and what's the best thing that could happen. What's the worst thing that can happen? What if a friend showed up? What if an enemy showed up? What if the phone rang? What if the TV broadcast a tornado warning? What if a car screeched to a stop outside the house? This is your time to play what if. With each scenario, you create a circle off that middle circle and have the new situation to think about. And this is what they call a story turn. So something new has happened. Something has interacted with the character and making them turn their story. So instead of being stalled, there's something they have to react to. And then you repeat the process until you have a series of linked bubbles. So from one bubble to the next, a situation happens and then they react to that and it goes to the next bubble. Here is a full bubble graph with Dorothy, who wants independence. In here, let's go to some of the different ones. So we say she starts a business. That's a very logical thing, but then Wall Street crashes. So that's kind of a dead end. Plus it's boring. Well, maybe not boring if you're doing a business book. Secondly, she gets a job. And then you can go into different types of job. Here is an example down below it where I said, okay, she works for Rachel Ray. I'm sure that can be a challenge. And for Dorothy, she's hit her last straw and she kills Rachel Ray and then she goes to prison. So that's kind of a dead end there. Then we say Dorothy wants independence, so maybe she runs away from home. One option, she runs away from home, she meets Richard Gere. And that's a completely different story than where we were headed. So we keep that one and say, maybe that's the way we want to go. Then she runs away, and there is that tornado warning, and there's a tornado. Picks up the house, she lands in Oz. Then what happens? So you can see there's step by step by step. So basically, you're plotting out the story. And it's just a good visual to see all the different ways you can go, because they might link back. So once she's in Oz, maybe that's when she meets Richard Gere instead of the Scarecrow. So there's a lot of different things you can try with that. Do a bubble graph. Put your current character and where she stopped in the middle of the page in a circle, and then from there, jump off to different things that could happen. Again, think about things that interrupt what she's doing. Again, think about what's the best thing that could happen. Think about what's the worst thing that can happen. What if somebody shows up, friend or enemy? What if there's a natural disaster like a tornado, or a mother-in-law shows up? What would happen at that point? Look at your character's motivations. So why does the character do what he or she does? So for a good exercise, go through and look at your character's motivations, make a list of questions to get to the real answers. So this is good as you're even doing your automatic writing. You can sit there and say, okay, why is this character doing what she's doing? What is it that's making her want to do it? Everybody has a reason to do what they do. I've always heard that everyone's a hero of their own story. Another way to get through stalled writing is to research. And this works well because it'll give you some ideas of things. When I did Under a Copper Moon, again, it was a historical novel, and I researched Jerome, Arizona, which was the mining town, and I lived near there at the time. And I found some information that was actually facts that had happened in newspapers and letters and historical society that I incorporated into the book. I fictionalized it some, but for the most part, it gave me some subplots by actually doing some research. Do you feel like you have gotten off track with your story? This happens a lot, and it stops you because you had this idea from the bubble graph that you were going in a certain direction, taking a certain path. All of a sudden, you're over here when you thought you were going to be over here. So the good way to do that is go back and really reevaluate. Go back to that bubble graph and say, well, was it more interesting to go in this direction? So I need to revise it and go that way. Now, if you've gone off on a tangent and you've hit a block wall, then maybe you go back to your bubble graph and say, okay, here's where I changed something and the original path might have been better. If you feel like you've come to a dead end because you've strayed in the story, go back and think about what the story is really about. So focus on the theme. What is the theme you're covering with the story? Does the current scene support that? I mean, you can be in a scene that's interesting, but really doesn't have anything to do with the theme of the story, what you're trying to convey to the reader. If you feel off track, it could be because you're taking on something too large. Are you trying to tell the tale of a family through several generations? Are you overwhelmed by that? Put it down in writing so you can see the scope of your work. You might have to narrow that scope down. But here's a way to go through and look to see, is your scope too big? So with step one, what is the time frame covered in the plot? So are you trying to cover 200 years? Maybe that's too much. Who are the major characters? The characters who will develop and change over the course of the story. So know what your time frame is, know who these major characters are. And then third, what are the subplots that intertwine around the main plot? The more subplots you have, the more complex that story is going to be and the longer the story's going to be. Then step 4 is if you feel overwhelmed, try reducing the time frame covered by the story, combine characters where possible so that you've only got 2 or 3 major characters and just a few minor ones, and or simplify the plot and the subplots. Lots of times the problem could be you have too many ideas, and it needs to be distilled down to just what the core is. And again, think about your theme, and are all these characters and plots and subplots going back to that. One suggestion I've always had, and I heard this when I first started writing, but to think about plot lines, subplots, the plot line and subplots, like braiding a girl's hair, you need at least 3. So 3 work well, crossing over and combining those together and going from one to the other. If you've got a main storyline and 2 subplots, that works well. If you're doing any more subplots than that, it might get a little too complicated. Getting on track again, know your audience. Think about who you're writing for. Who do you see reading this book? Think about what the story is about and why that certain reader cares about it. A young adult novel might personalize cultural conflicts in the meeting of 2 different characters, but the history and founding of those cultures would be more than a reader can endure. So, science fiction. A lot of science fiction, you're world building, so they do go into the culture of the different characters. So you've got 2 different characters from 2 different planets. It is important to know something about them, but if you're doing, a romance set in contemporary times, you can rely that your reader knows certain things and you don't have to rehash those. So as they always say, when you go back and edit, take out the parts that people skip when they read. So that's the introduction for overcoming writer's block, and specifically into the first barrier to finishing a project, which is coming up with ideas, the inspiration, the creativity. In the next video, we'll talk about how to handle time. If you feel like you're just not finding the time to work on your novel or your book, that there are some techniques that will help you give it the importance that it needs and the time to get it finished. So I will see you in the next one.